Mark stood drenched in the freezing rain, his lungs burning and his nose shattered, staring at the blue light of a smartphone screen that had just dismantled his entire life. Behind him, the sirens of 4 police cruisers wailed, closing in to arrest him for a murder he didn't commit. Ahead of him, his best friend David stood perfectly calm, holding a tablet that showed a live feed of Mark's daughter being followed by a black SUV. "One click, Mark," David whispered over the roar of the storm, "and she disappears from every server and every street corner, forever." The digital fortress Mark had spent a decade building hadn't just been breached. It had been turned into a cage. As the red and blue lights reflected off the mud and the poison pill file began to count down on his shattered laptop, Mark realized the hardware tap wasn't coming from outside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his daughter's favorite gold locket, the one David had given her for her birthday. Inside, nestled against her photo, was a microscopic GPS transponder pulsing with a rhythmic, mocking green light. The man he called brother had been inside their house, their heads, and their lives for months. And now the police were here to finish the job for him. The screen glowed too bright in the dim bedroom, casting a sickly blue tint over the keyboard. Mark's fingers hovered above the keys, the plastic warm from his palms. He'd meant to check his emails, just a quick scan before bed. But the subject line stopped him cold. Chloe Whitman's internship application, final decision. His stomach twisted. He clicked. The messages unfolded like a poisoned gift. Polite, professional, devastating. "I regret to inform you that your recent behavior has raised concerns about your suitability for our program." Attached were screenshots. Chloe's supposed replies, laced with sarcasm, unprofessional jabs at the hiring committee. The tone was unmistakably hers, the words sharp enough to draw blood. But Mark knew his sister. She'd never write, "I'd rather scrub toilets than work for a company that values spreadsheets over actual talent." Not in a million years. Mark leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. He navigated through the metadata of the sent folder, his eyes narrowing at the header information. The timestamps were consistent, but the routing was jagged, a messy trail of proxy servers that screamed of a deliberate, calculated fabrication. Someone hadn't just guessed her password. They had built a mirror of her digital life, a hollow version of his daughter designed to incinerate her future before it even began. It wasn't a random glitch or a misunderstood joke. It was an execution. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. He minimized the window, but the damage was done. The air smelled of burnt toast and stale coffee, the remnants of Chloe's failed attempt at breakfast. She'd been up since dawn, pacing, muttering to herself about deadlines and second chances. Now her voice drifted from the living room, thin and brittle. "It's over. They don't even want to interview me." Mark found her curled on the couch, her phone clutched in both hands like a lifeline. The screen's light carved hollows under her eyes. She didn't look up when he sat beside her, just exhaled, a shaky, wet sound. She was 16, but in the harsh blue light, she looked fragile, a bird with clipped wings. "They said I was unprofessional, like I'd ever..." Her voice cracked. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth, but the tears came anyway. Silent at first, then in hiccuping gasps. The weight of the world, or at least the digital version of it, was crushing her. Mark reached for her, but she flinched, her shoulders hunching as if expecting another blow from the ether. "Don't, I can't..." The words dissolved into a sob. The couch cushion dipped under his weight, the fabric rough against his palm. Outside, a car alarm blared, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. Mark felt the familiar itch in his fingertips, the urge to reach for a keyboard and dismantle whoever had done this. He wasn't just a father tonight. He was a hunter. "Someone did this to you," he said, low and certain. The words tasted like ash. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the room. It wasn't just the internship. As he stood there, his military-grade smartwatch pulsed against his wrist. A silent, rhythmic vibration. It was a network alert. His home firewall, a fortress he'd spent years reinforcing with proprietary scripts and redundant layers of encryption, was flagging a breach. The red icon on his wrist flickered like a dying star. The attack on Chloe wasn't an isolated incident. It was a breach of their entire sanctuary. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He left Chloe on the couch, her quiet sobs echoing in the hallway, and retreated to his office. The room was a tomb of high-end hardware, the hum of cooling fans providing a low-frequency soundtrack to his rising paranoia. He dropped into his chair, his long fingers dancing across the keys with a speed born of a decade in the Pentagon's shadows. He didn't just look at the logs. He inhaled them. The traffic was a chaotic web of unauthorized requests. Someone was inside his router, bypassing the WPA3 encryption as if it were a screen door. He deployed his forensic toolkit, launching a recursive trace that clawed through the obfuscation layers. He wasn't just looking for an IP, he was looking for a signature, a thumbprint in the code. The intruder was efficient, moving with a familiarity that made the hair on Mark's neck stand up. They weren't just hacking a house, they were navigating a home they seemed to know. A soft chime at the front door broke his concentration. Mark froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He checked the porch camera on his secondary monitor. David Miller stood there, his face a picture of suburban concern. David, the man who lived 3 doors down. The man who had been Mark's best friend since they were both 22, and convinced they could program their way into immortality. Mark exhaled, the tension in his shoulders dropping only a fraction. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and went to the door. David didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped into the foyer, the scent of sandalwood and expensive laundry detergent trailing after him. "I saw the lights, Mark, and Chloe, she texted me. Something about the internship?" David's voice was warm, a rich baritone that usually acted as a balm. He looked past Mark, his eyes finding Chloe in the living room. "Hey, kiddo, come here." David walked toward her with the practiced ease of a favorite uncle. He sat on the edge of the coffee table, leaning in, making himself small to match her posture. Mark stayed in the doorway of his office, watching. He felt a strange, jagged disconnect. While David was whispering reassurances to Chloe, telling her that mistakes happen and that he'd help her find something even better, Mark's mind was still back at the desk, staring at the jagged lines of the network breach. "Mark, you okay?" David called out, not looking back. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a glitch, David. A big one," Mark replied, his voice sounding like gravel. He turned back to his screens. He couldn't afford to be present in the way David was. He needed to be the wall. He needed to be the firewall. Back in the office, the terminal window flickered. He'd caught a tail. The intruder was sloppy for a split second, a packet header leaking a local MAC address. Mark's brow furrowed. He ran a signal strength analysis, a heat map of the wireless interference surrounding the house. The results were impossible. The source of the intrusion wasn't coming from a server in Eastern Europe or a VPN in the Caymans. The signal was coming from less than 50 feet away. It was hovering just outside the walls, a ghost in the garden. Mark stood up so quickly, his chair hit the wall with a dull thud. He didn't say a word to David or Chloe. He grabbed a heavy, industrial-grade mag light from his desk drawer, the cold aluminum solid in his grip. He moved through the kitchen, his boots silent on the hardwood, and reached the back sliding glass door. Through the glass, the backyard was a blur of gray and charcoal shadows. The rain had started, a fine, misty drizzle that turned the manicured lawn into a slick trap. He saw it then, a flicker of movement near the overgrown maple tree in the far corner. A silhouette, darker than the night, crouched near the fence line. The intruder wasn't just a digital ghost, he was flesh and bone. Mark slid the door open. The humidity hit him like a damp shroud. He didn't shout, he didn't call the police. He simply stepped out into the mud, the mag light unlit, moving with the predatory grace he'd learned in places the Pentagon didn't put on maps. He could hear the mechanical struggle, the faint, rhythmic clicking of someone trying to force the secondary latch on the basement window. The figure was masked. A dark hoodie pulled low, gloved hands working a crowbar with frantic, jerky motions. Mark was 10 feet away when the intruder turned. The pale glow of a nearby neighbor's security light caught the glint of a smartphone screen clutched in the intruder's left hand. "Get away from the house," Mark growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The intruder didn't run. Not at first. He lunged. The collision was brutal. Mark felt the impact in his chest, the air whistling out of his lungs. They tumbled into the mud, the rain-slicked earth offering no purchase. Mark swung the mag light, the heavy casing connecting with the intruder's shoulder, with a sickening thud. The man grunted. A young sound, high-pitched and panicked. He clawed at Mark's face, his gloves smelling of ozone and cheap tobacco. They rolled, a chaotic tangle of limbs and wet fabric. Mark managed to pin the man's arm, twisting it back until he heard the joint groan. In the struggle, the intruder's smartphone slipped from his pocket, landing in the mud with a soft splash. The screen flickered to life. A terminal window, lines of green code scrolling at a furious pace. The intruder found a burst of desperate strength, slamming his forehead into Mark's nose. White light exploded in Mark's vision. He tasted copper. His grip loosened just enough for the man to scramble upward. The intruder didn't look back. He bolted toward the fence, leaping over the splintered wood with a frantic, uncoordinated grace and disappearing into the black maw of the woods behind the property. Mark stayed on his knees for a moment, the rain washing the blood from his lip. He didn't chase. He couldn't. He reached out into the mud and closed his fingers around the discarded smartphone. It was a victory. But as he stood up, his legs shaking, he felt the weight of the device. It was warm. It was still logged in. He retreated back inside, the sliding door clicking shut behind him. He bypassed the living room, ignoring David's concerned, "Mark? What was that noise?" and locked himself in the office. He wiped the mud from the phone with a microfiber cloth. The encryption was standard, the kind of thing a talented amateur would use. It took him 6 minutes to crack the 4-digit PIN and bypass the biometric lock using a bypass script he'd kept on a thumb drive for emergencies. The home screen loaded. A photo of a smiling young man in a university hoodie stared back at him. Mark's heart stopped. He knew that face. It was Jason, no, Tyler. Tyler Vance. A brilliant IT student Mark had mentored at the local community college 2 years ago. The kid had been a sponge, soaking up every lesson Mark gave on network security and ethical hacking. Mark had even written his recommendation letter for a scholarship. Tyler, Mark whispered, the name tasting like poison. He didn't stop there. He opened the GPS cache. The map of Naperville bloomed on the screen, a cluster of red dots marking the phone's history. Mark's house was buried under a mountain of those dots. Tyler hadn't just been here tonight. He had been lurking on the perimeter every single day for the last 30 days. He'd been watching the house, tracking the Wi-Fi signal, waiting for the moments when the firewalls were at their thinnest. But why? Tyler was a kid who cried when his code didn't compile. He wasn't a home invader. Mark stood up, his mind racing. He needed to know how the breach happened. If Tyler had been outside, how did he get past the physical security? He grabbed a handheld signal detector and began a slow, methodical sweep of the living room. David and Chloe were still talking, their voices a low hum in the background. Mark ignored them, his eyes fixed on the detector's needle. He reached the far wall, near the primary power outlet that fed the home theater system. The needle pegged into the red. He knelt, pulling the heavy oak cabinet away from the wall. Behind the tangled mess of HDMI cables and power strips, he saw it. A small black plastic housing, no larger than a matchbox, was plugged directly into the back of the outlet. It was a hardware tap, a physical bridge that bypassed the router's software security entirely. It was a man-in-the-middle device, feeding every keystroke, every password, every private email directly into the airwaves. Tyler hadn't hacked them from the internet. He'd been invited in, or he'd broken in weeks ago to plant the bug. Mark looked at the device, the tiny green LED blinking like a mocking eye. Their privacy wasn't just compromised. It had been dismantled from the inside out. The next morning, the sun didn't bring any warmth. It only highlighted the cracks. Mark sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, watching Chloe. She was staring at her phone, her thumb twitching in a repetitive, nervous motion. "Chloe, put it down," Mark said, his voice softer than he felt. "I can't," she whispered. "Look." She slid the phone across the table. Mark's stomach dropped. It was a social media thread, Instagram, TikTok, the digital playgrounds where reputations were made and destroyed. Someone had uploaded a series of photos. They were doctored, but the work was seamless. It showed Chloe at a party she'd never attended, holding a bottle of vodka, her eyes glazed, her arm draped around a man twice her age. The captions were brutal. "Internship rejected for a reason." The quiet ones are always the worst. The comments were a feeding tube of vitriol. Her friends, her classmates, people she'd known since kindergarten, were turning on her in real time. The digital mob was gathering, and they were hungry. "It's not me, Dad. I was at the library that night. You picked me up," she said, her voice trembling. "I know, honey, I know." Mark felt a surge of helpless rage. He checked his tablet. An automated alert from the school district popped up. Emergency board meeting, student conduct review. They had 4 hours. 4 hours before the school board met to discuss the evidence and move for her immediate expulsion. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was a countdown to the end of her life as she knew it. "Stay here," Mark ordered. "Lock the doors. Don't answer the phone. I need to fix this." He went to the basement, his hands shaking as he pulled up the network monitor. He tried to kill the ports, to shut down the broadcast from the hardware tap. But every time he closed a bridge, another one snapped open. It was like fighting a hydra. The attacker was watching him in real time, counter-coding every move he made. Then, the house began to turn. The hum of the HVAC system shifted into a high-pitched whine. Mark looked at the smart thermostat on the wall. The digital display was climbing. 95, 85, 95, 100 degrees. The air became thick, oppressive. He tried to override it from his phone, but the app was locked out. Access denied. A heavy thunk echoed through the house. The electronic deadbolts on the front and back doors slid into place. The motorized shutters on the windows hummed, lowering themselves until the house was bathed in a tomb-like darkness. They were trapped. In the living room, the family dog, a golden retriever named Buster, began to bark. It wasn't his "someone's at the door" bark. It was a low, territorial growl. He was staring at a specific section of the drywall, his hackles raised. Mark ran to the room, his sweat-slicked shirt clinging to his back. He followed the dog's gaze. He reached out, his fingers tracing the seam of the wallpaper. He felt a slight protrusion. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a letter opener from the side table and slashed through the paper, peeling back a chunk of the drywall. There, embedded in the insulation, was a pinhole lens. A high-definition camera, wired directly into the house's electrical system. It wasn't just Tyler. This was professional-grade surveillance. This house hadn't been a home for weeks. It had been a studio. "Dad?" Chloe's voice was small, terrified. "Get in the basement, Chloe. Now." Mark didn't wait. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy chair, and smashed the reinforced glass of the small window above the sink. The heat was unbearable now, the air smelling of toasted dust. He scrambled through the frame, falling into the dirt outside. He didn't care about the cuts on his arms. He had an address. Tyler Vance's apartment. He drove like a madman, his old Jeep weaving through the quiet streets of Naperville. The contrast was sickening. Neighbors mowing lawns, kids on bikes, while his world was being incinerated by a ghost. Tyler's apartment was on the edge of town, a drab brick complex that smelled of damp concrete. Mark didn't knock. He used a shim to pop the lock, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Tyler, we need to talk." The silence that greeted him was absolute. The apartment was a wreck, screens everywhere, half-eaten pizza boxes, the blue light of a dozen monitors casting long shadows. Mark moved toward the desk. Tyler was there. He was slumped in his chair, his head back, his eyes staring at the ceiling. A single neat hole was centered in his forehead. On the desk, a typed note rested near his hand. "I couldn't live with what I did." "No," Mark whispered. "No, no, no." He checked the wound. No stippling, no powder burns. This wasn't a suicide. This was a cleanup. A floorboard creaked behind him. Mark didn't turn. He dove. A silenced shot hissed through the air, shattering the monitor where Tyler's head had been resting a second before. Mark rolled behind a heavy filing cabinet. He caught a glimpse of the shooter, a woman, mid-30s, wearing a sharp blazer and sensible shoes. She looked like a real estate agent, except for the suppressed Glock in her hand and the flat, dead look in her tea-colored eyes. "The cleaner, Mark Whitman," she said, her voice soft, almost polite. "You should have stayed in the house." She fired again, the bullet thudding into the metal cabinet. Mark looked around desperately. He was in a narrow utility closet. To his left, a red lever for the building's old-school chemical fire suppression system. He lunged for it. The woman fired, the bullet grazing his shoulder, but he slammed the lever down. A roar filled the room as white, acrid foam erupted from the ceiling vents. It was a blinding, suffocating cloud. Mark didn't wait for her to recover. He used the smoke screen to bolt for the door, his lungs burning. He heard her coughing, heard the frantic zip-zip of more shots, but he was already in the hallway, stumbling toward the fire escape. He didn't go back to the Jeep. He ran through the alleys, his mind a fractured mess of fear and realization. He'd been wrong about Tyler. Tyler was a pawn. But who was the king? He made it back to his house 2 hours later, slipping through the broken kitchen window. Chloe was still in the basement, huddled under a blanket. The house was quiet now, the thermostat reset, the locks open. The predator was playing with them. Mark sat on the floor of the hallway, his head in his hands. He looked at Chloe's locket, which she'd left on the table. It was a beautiful silver piece, a gift from David for her 16th birthday. Wait. He picked it up. He held it to his ear. A faint, almost imperceptible electronic hum. He grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers from his pocket. He didn't care about the craftsmanship. He pried the silver casing apart. Inside, nestled behind the photo of Chloe and her mother, was a wafer-thin GPS tag and a MEMS microphone. The betrayal hit him like a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. David. David, who had been there every night. David, who had comforted Chloe while his devices tracked her heart rate. David, who knew exactly where the firewalls were because Mark had shown him. Mark stood up, his eyes cold. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a singular, burning purpose. He went to his laptop, the one he'd kept offline, the one David didn't know about. He began to type. He wasn't defending anymore. He was building a trap. Mark? The voice came from the foyer. David was back. He walked in, carrying a bag of takeout, his smile wide and practiced. I brought dinner. How's the school board stuff going? Mark didn't look up from the screen. It's handled, David. I found the source. David froze, the bag of food crinkling in his hand. The mask didn't slip. It dissolved. His eyes went flat, the hunger finally visible. Did you know? David reached into his pocket and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen and slid it across the counter. It was a live video feed. Chloe. She wasn't in the basement. She was walking down the street, her hoodie up, her head down. Behind her, a black SUV was crawling along the curb, its windows tinted. She's a runner, Mark. Just like her mother, David said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, low register. One call, and the driver takes her to a place where no one has Wi-Fi. You won't, Mark growled. I don't have to. The police are already on their way, Mark. I used Tyler's laptop to send a little confession from your IP. Murder, domestic abuse. It's a compelling narrative. You're the monster. I'm the one who saves her. David turned toward the intercom system. Chloe, can you hear me, honey? Your dad, he's having another episode. He's the one who leaked the photos. He's trying to keep you here. Run, Chloe. Run to the park. Stop it! Mark lunged, but David was younger, stronger. He shoved Mark back against the server rack. Chloe's voice erupted from the hallway, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't know who to trust. She saw the blood on Mark's shirt from the apartment, saw the madness in his eyes, and she did exactly what David wanted. She bolted out the back door, disappearing into the rain. Now, David whispered, leaning in close. Watch what happens when a system fails. He tapped a command on his tablet. The house went dark. A system-bricked message flashed across Mark's monitors. Every line of code, every scrap of evidence Mark had gathered, was being overwritten by zeros. Mark was blind. He was a murderer in the eyes of the law, and his daughter was running into the arms of a predator. The sirens were close now, the blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. David smiled, a small, sad curve of the lips. 3 minutes, Mark. That's all it takes to lose everything. David stepped out into the night, leaving Mark in the ruins of his digital fortress. But Mark wasn't done. He didn't need a server. He didn't need a high-speed connection. He went to the basement floor, pulling back the rug to reveal a hidden utility hatch. He grabbed a manual hand-crank drill and began to bite into the concrete, through the reinforced wall, until he reached the primary fiber-optic trunk line that fed the entire neighborhood. He didn't use a router. He took an ancient, clunky tough book from a lead-lined box, a relic from his Pentagon days that ran on a proprietary, non-networked OS. He stripped the wires of the fiber line and used an analog hardware interface, a vampire tap, to bleed the data directly into the laptop. He was inside the raw stream now. He saw the traffic of the entire street. He saw David's spoofed emergency texts. He saw the command to the black SUV. Miller's Point, 10 p.m. Mark didn't wait for the police to kick in the door. He slipped through the ventilation shaft, his lean frame scraping against the metal, and emerged in the detached garage. He didn't take the Jeep. He pulled the tarp off a 1974 Norton Commando, a mechanical beast with no ECU, no GPS, no way to be hacked. He kicked it to life, the roar of the engine drowning out the sirens. He tore down the driveway, bypassing the tactical team as they swarmed his front porch. He reached Miller's Point in 10 minutes. The park was a void of shadows and creaking swings. He saw the black SUV idling near the pavilion. He saw Chloe standing near the slide, looking around frantically. Mark pulled the Norton to a stop 100 yards away. He opened the tough book. He didn't just hack David. He hijacked the park's public Wi-Fi transmitter, boosting the signal until it saturated every device within a mile. He executed the ghost command. "Look at your phones!" Mark screamed into the night, though no one could hear him. Every screen in the area, the SUV's dashboard, the phones of the passing police cruisers, the tablets in the hands of the neighbors, suddenly flickered. A video began to play. It wasn't a doctoring. It was David's own hidden cloud server, a decade of stalking logs, fabricated evidence, and the recording of him killing Tyler Vance. David, standing near the SUV, pulled his phone from his pocket. He watched his own face on the screen, admitting to the camera, "I break them so I can be the one to fix them." The SUV doors flew open. The accomplices, seeing the digital writing on the wall, didn't stay to fight. They bolted into the woods. Mark ran across the grass, skidding to a halt in front of Chloe. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her behind him, his body a shield. The police arrived seconds later, but they weren't looking for Mark. They had the broadcast. They had the logs. They saw David Miller standing in the middle of the playground, his digital empire crumbling around his feet. "It's over, David," Mark said, his voice steady for the first time in years. The arrest was quiet. The sirens faded. The digital noise stopped. 2 days later, the curb in front of the Whitman house was piled high with expensive monitors, server racks, and tangled nests of Cat6 cable. Mark stood there with a sledgehammer, systematically smashing the screens into glittering shards. He went back inside. The house felt different. It was quiet. It was empty. It was safe. He walked out to the porch. Chloe was sitting on the steps, her hair tucked behind her ears, watching the sun dip below the horizon. There were no phones, no tablets, just the orange light and the sound of the wind in the trees. Mark sat down beside her. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't check his alerts. He just looked at his daughter. "You see that?" he asked, pointing to the sky. "The sunset?" she whispered. "No," Mark said, a small smile touching his lips. The silence. They sat together in the fading light. Two people no longer caught in the web, finally learning how to breathe in a world that was no longer watching.